Preface to the Tower of London by Walter George Bell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Janet. The Tower of London by Walter George Bell. Preface. These chapters upon the Tower of London were written for the Daily Telegraph, and they are reprinted with the kind permission of its proprietors. My purpose was a simple one, to endeavour to interest Londoners in their own possession. I have stepped into no controversies, still less have I attempted any contribution towards settling them. If I am told that everything here said is familiar, then I shall be glad, for that will indicate a deeper knowledge by London citizens of their historical buildings and the matchless history of their city than has been disclosed to my own experience. Never yet have I met the man who has made open confession that he does not know the Tower. There would be a sense of shame in it. The misfortune for Londoners is that the Tower is in London, where they have no time for seeing it, not, as it should be, in some fastness of Wales, or remote in Cornwall, or perched upon a mountain in the Lake District. Then every London visitor on holiday would hasten to go over it. When I have pressed anyone casually met to say when he was last at the Tower of London, the reply has been, "Ah, well now, yes, it must be quite 15 years, but I mean to go." My own effort will have served its end if it sends him there. The justification for this volume must be found primarily in Mr. Hanslip Fletcher's drawings, for in them he displays a sympathy with his subject which rarely has been achieved with such success. It is good that a great London newspaper should enrich its pages with such artistic illustrations. For present purposes, I have somewhat enlarged the scope of the chapters. In condonation of my offence in producing yet another book upon the Tower of London, may I plead that there is no other short book accessible? End of preface. Chapter 1 of The Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 1 The Fortress. William the Conqueror built a formidable tower or keep, 4 square, to all the winds that blow, which is the central and most conspicuous structure of the fortress, and the Tower of London it was then and ever since has been. It has never been called a castle. The tower has stood to guard the river gate of London for 8½ centuries, and nothing else within it has the age, or indeed the strength, of this earliest work, the Norman keep. The Conqueror had 2 objects in view when he began to raise this formidable pile of masonry by the Thames side, 12 years after his seizure of the English crown. It should dispute the passage of any enemy who might venture to sail up the Thames to attack the commercial capital. But more than this measure of protection, one imagines, it was designed to overawe the Londoners. It was studied insolence on the Conqueror's part to throw down a length of the defensive wall that had been London's protection in order that he might build his tower. The wall that had existed since the knowledge of man knew not to the contrary, in fact, since the Roman occupation. Because of this challenging act, flung out, as it were, in defiance of any who should contest his will, a portion of the tower, less than 8 acres, stands outside the city as anciently limited by its wall, the remainder of its 18 acres, if the outer scarp be included, being within the wall. A fragment of the Roman wall which encircled London still may be seen by the little ruin of the demolished Wardrobe Tower, near the south east angle of the keep. Not the ruin rising some 8 or 10 feet high, which often is mistaken for it. The Roman masonry is level with the ground, being merely the base of the wall, and is noteworthy as the only piece exposed which shows the sandstone footing with its bevelled edge. William the Conqueror built the keep as we have it, a stronghold amply sufficient in that day to stand by itself. Its massive walls in the lower courses are 15 feet in thickness, and high above ground fully 11 feet, too substantial to be burrowed through by the poor military engines of the 11th century. Little harm could then befall it, especially when it was defended by armed men above. Its single entrance was raised high, well out of reach of besiegers attacking the fortification, after the stage which gave access had been knocked away, isolating the garrison. There is question where the original entrance was placed, but it is probably indicated by remains of an important arch to be seen on the south wall. The dungeons had no entrance from the level, but were reached solely by the internal staircase within the north-eastern corner turret, which ran down to their depths and up to the roof and battlements of the keep. A single entrance meant safety. Water for a besieged garrison was provided by the wide-mouthed well, 40 feet in depth, with sides closely masoned, which still fills below the floor of one chamber. The light of an electric lamp today illuminates it. As an isolated fort, the keep fulfilled every need. It is doubtful if in the Conqueror's lifetime any other portion of the fortress was completed. If begun in 1078, the date generally accepted, there remained but 9 years of his reign, and military works of such formidable nature as these made slow progress. Gundulf, the monk of the great Abbey of Bec, made Bishop of Rochester soon after his arrival in England, built the Norman keep, and he toiled on with his military architecture through the reigns of William Rufus and Henry I. He built much else, including the strong walls of Rochester and part of the existing cathedral. Gundulf died in the year 1108 at the ripe age of 84. By that time, probably, encircling works about the keep had taken shape. They may have been first of a temporary nature, mere ditch and scarp and palisade, till a high stone ballium wall rose all around, strengthened as a means of defence by towers at intervals, the wall that today marks the limits of the inner ward. Gundulf's work may perhaps be seen in the most ancient parts of the Wakefield Tower, where today the Regalia is safe kept, but recent authorities believe that to be principally the work of Stephen and Henry II. Its walls are 8 feet thick. Through this defensive turret, admission was, at one time, obtained to the royal palace, afterwards built within the tower, a place of refuge for the sovereign, there strongly guarded should need arise. Outer fortifications. King John and others are credited with some share in the strengthening of the wall containing the inner ward, employing the term in use today. But it was not till King Henry III set his hand to the outer fortifications that the Tower of London took the form in which we know it. Till then it consisted of a central keep and one wall, with towers about it as a supplementary defence, roughly square. This inner ward of today possessed one entrance and one alone, the dark and frowning archway beneath the Bloody Tower, itself of great antiquity, having the Wakefield Tower on its right. Its heavy portcullis with winch is still in place, and still in working order, ready to be lowered. That was the entrance to the tower, whether for kings, prisoners of state, or for the garrison, and below the gate the bank shelved steeply to the tidal Thames flowing by. The boats rode up here, all passed that way by the one gate. That is why the Bloody Tower and the Wakefield Tower were built so strong. It was a land fortress. The formation on the foreshore of the Thames of the Tower Wharf, which is as old as Henry III, the building complete of the outer wall, with its large bastions and the 6 towers on the river face, and the digging all round, or with more likelihood deepening, of a moat into which the Thames water flowed, greatly strengthened the fortress and, moreover, greatly altered its appearance. The old means of entrance beneath the Bloody Tower now became merely an internal gateway. It is still the only legitimate means of access to the Inner Ward, the entrance by which visitors today pass being merely a breach in the wall made last century for convenience of running stores from the river wharf up to the keep. Access by water was given by Traitors Gate, heavily guarded by the St. Thomas's Tower built above it. A principal entrance had to be made west for use by the garrison and all coming and going by land. The strong byward tower can be traced back to Richard II, but a defensive turret and gate here became a first necessity of the scheme of outer fortifications, and probably were raised by King Henry III. He was the greatest builder among our kings, and his gigantic works in masonry are seen at Westminster Abbey and Windsor Castle, as well as at the Tower. Long as he reigned, he could not do all. There is much Edwardian work in London's fortress, and interior vaulting in certain of the towers indicates the period of King Richard II. From the Byward Tower a drawbridge could be thrown across the moat to meet the causeway. By the land or city side, guarding was a work known as the Lion Tower, all traces of which have now disappeared. As an additional defence at the entrance was built the Middle Tower. This is attributed to King Edward I, and the moat was diverted hereabouts into 2 wide streams. The Middle Tower is the first to be passed today, and the name seems meaningless, but it was so called because it stood middle between the Byward Tower across the moat and the Lion Tower towards the city bank. In order to understand the fortress, it is necessary to realize that it consists of these 3 parts. They are of different ages and consist of 1. The central Norman keep. 2. Encircling the keep, the wall about the Inner Ward, with its 12 surviving towers, of which the Bell Tower, the Bloody Tower, Wakefield Tower, and Beauchamp Tower are best known to visitors, and 3. Encircling these in turn the outer line of fortifications, beginning at the Byward Tower, the moat being external to all. After carrying the outer fortifications, an attacking host would be brought up by the inner wall, some 40 feet in height. If that was successfully assailed, the survivors among the garrison could retire into the keep, and there hold out. The Tower of London was, in fact, immensely strong. All this is, of course, obvious to anybody who studies the plan. But numbers of persons, hurrying to get to the most historical spots, find themselves by the keep, or on the execution ground of Tower Green, or at the Beauchamp Tower, with turrets and walls about them, and small appreciation of their meaning. It then seems a strangely confused place. A little knowledge beforehand of why the buildings came to be so placed, and the purposes which each was intended to serve, greatly adds to the intelligent enjoyment of a visit to this most historical of all our fortresses. Purposely, to avoid confusion of mind, I have mentioned by name only those towers about the inner ward which are accessible to the public and known to them. The others are, to a lesser extent, living history, and the inquirer will find them indicated in the plan here attached. A State Prison. The Tower of London became the one great State prison because it was so strong, a prison that in Tudor days was crowded with the victims of our devious system of statecraft. It was not built for that, and indeed a single stone stronghold, sufficiently isolated, would have served that end better. But early in its record it was utilized as a place of confinement for prisoners of distinction, and royal captives of our wars held to ransom. It was a royal palace, never indeed comfortable, and as such was used by all the English sovereigns till Charles II, who was the last to lodge there before his coronation, and make the historic journey in procession from the Tower through the city streets to Westminster. Its walls guarded the Mint, and the coinage of the realm was struck within the Tower till so late as the year 1812, a use that in these times is often forgotten. There is no other building so closely identified with the whole course of our history as is the Tower of London. Looking back over the centuries during which it was rising, and serving its purpose as the defensive fortress of the capital, remember this. Then and long afterwards, the Thames was the one great highway of London for business and pleasure, used by kings and nobles and merchants, and by all frequenting the palace and Parliament at Westminster, and the law courts assembled there. It never does to forget that. The mean streets of the city carried no great burden of traffic. Traitors Gate early had won its sinister name and significance, and it became necessary, or at least desirable, that other means of access by the river should be provided than Henry III's original Watergate. Accordingly, the Queen's Stairs were placed at the Tower Wharf, to which the boats drew up, and a light drawbridge over the moat and postern by the side of the Byward Tower admitted royalty and distinguished travellers to the Tower. There was also the Iron Gate, where the Tower Bridge approaches now run beside the moat, but that was little used. All led to the Outer Bailey only, the one means of access to the inner ward still being beneath the Bloody Tower, and it was carefully guarded. The public, except in times of disturbance, were freely admitted to the Outer Bailey, but the inner ward was regarded as a royal area, as being the King's palace, and from that part till after Tudor days they were excluded. The old royal palace within the Tower was erected on ground between the keep and the inner wall towards the river, when manners softened and the cold comfort of the keep itself was found insufficient for kings more luxurious than were the first Norman masters of England. Little is, in fact, known of these royal apartments, and their age is uncertain. They contained a great hall on the line of the wall of the inner ward eastward of the Wakefield Tower, and from old picture maps which include the Tower, apparently had many rooms and scattered offices. Oliver Cromwell is credited with having destroyed the last remaining buildings, then much in decay, foreseeing in his blindness no future use for royal palaces for kings, since which time the distinction has had less importance. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 2. The Norman Keep. The Norman Keep is the oldest building of the Tower, and it is also the one which has undergone least change. Walls 15 feet in thickness, and masoned so well as these do not require a renovator, nor do they give him material upon which to display his unfortunate skill, save at excessive cost of labour. There has been one regrettable alteration. Strength was the first essential with the Norman builders, light and ventilation being quite subsidiary. Their windows were mere loopholes or narrow slits in the masonry, at least till a great height above ground was reached. The substitution 2 centuries ago of large windows with stone facings for the original Norman openings has done something to diminish the simple grandeur of these vast walls, till then impregnable. It is not necessarily Sir Christopher Wren's work, though to him is given the discredit. Major General Sir George Younghusband, the keeper of the Regalia, recently has pointed out that a plan dated 1721 exists in His Majesty's Office of Works, showing the old windows, and Wren then had passed his 90th year. Apart from this, the keep stands as the Conqueror and Gundulf, his architect, may themselves have looked upon it, the most perfect relic of Norman military architecture in England, the mighty Tower of London, as Freeman the historian enthusiastically calls it, having no eyes for anything else but this one austere building. Its height to the battlements is 90 feet. It is delusive at first sight. The keep is not square, as it seems. It has been correctly described as a large irregular stone building, no one side answering to another, nor any of its watchtowers, of which there are 4 at the top. The longest external measurement is 116 feet north to south, and 107 feet east to west. There is a large apsidal projection at the southeast corner, making the line of the apse of St. John's Chapel and of the crypt and subcrypt below it, and at the northeast corner is a circular turret from ground to roof, which gives access to each floor and goes down to the dungeons. Internally there are 3 cross walls, in parts 8 feet in thickness, which divide each floor into 3 rooms of unequal dimensions. The builders had ideas of spaciousness, and the one great chamber on each floor, measuring 90 feet to 95 feet in length, would be considered large in any modern palace. The keep is complete, containing within itself the accommodation requisite for fortress, royal palace, and state prison. The first story, known as the main floor, was that devoted to the main guard of the fortress, and in ancient days was crowded with mailed officers and men-at-arms, the garrison, necessarily a large body. They had to post sentries along the walls, and man the embattlement turrets, and to keep watch from the high observation towers of the keep, over the city and a wide expanse of open country and river, to see who was approaching London. Above, the state apartments fill the 2 floors, the lower of these containing the banqueting hall and St. John's Chapel, and the topmost floor the council chamber of our sovereigns. They must not be pictured as always presenting the chilling aspect of today, so stern and forbidding. With carpets and arras and tapestry hanging from the walls, much of this bare stone was concealed, and the apartments contained the simple but massive furniture of the time. The floors were never borne by arches. There was no great arch, sprung to carry the weight and give stability, as is seen at Castle Hedingham, a magnificent Norman keep in Essex, built a little later. Beam construction was used, and owing to the wide spans from wall to wall, supports by heavy timber logs must always have been necessary. Those now in service are not of the most ancient date. As the White Tower, the keep has for ages been known, and in the earliest drawings we have of it, a beautifully coloured picture story attached to the poems of Charles, Prince of Orleans, a marriage gift by King Henry VII to his Queen Elizabeth of York, now in the British Museum collection, it appears radiantly white against the grey turrets and walls of the fortress. It is said to have obtained that name from having been coated with whitewash, and a dozen writers have so repeated. Perhaps. But there is no historical basis for the assumption that I know, and I have always been sceptical about that whitewash coat, no easy matter to apply to these broad walls, rising 90 feet in height. Historical associations. It is about the Council Chamber on the topmost floor that the incidents of England's history associated with the Keep mostly gather. There was made the accusation by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, which afforded Shakespeare the material for a dramatic scene in his King Richard III. A circular stairway leads up, and a vaulted passage, only 3 feet in width, has upon this floor been left in the thickness of the exterior wall, right round the 4 walls of the Keep. Its purpose is somewhat vague, but it has been thought to be designed so that, in the event of a siege, the troops on the roof might communicate more readily with other floors of the Keep by the internal stairways. This passage, on that June day of 1483, had been filled with armed soldiers, concealed. At a signal from Richard, bringing his fist down violently on the table around which the council was assembled, cries of "Treason! Treason!" were heard without. Soldiers rushing in seized Lord Hastings, whom the Protector denounced for plotting his destruction, and dispersed the council. Hastings, without pretence of trial, was hurried below for execution outside the Keep, a rough timber log brought there for purposes of repairs, serving for the block. In this same apartment King Richard II, when fortune's favour deserted him and the reign which had begun so auspiciously ended, surrendered his crown to Henry of Bolingbroke, another scene which Shakespeare has pictured with undying pathos. Prelates, lords, knights, and judges of England had proceeded on horseback to the Tower, passing a stately procession to this chamber, and Richard, a prisoner, crowned and robed, appeared in their midst. Froissart's simple prose perhaps tells the anguish of the moment as poignantly as any. I have been King of England, Duke of Aquitaine, and Lord of Ireland about 21 years, which seigneury, royalty, sceptre, crown, and heritage I clearly resign here to my cousin, Henry of Lancaster, and I desire him here, in this open presence, in entering of the same possession, to take this sceptre. The mystery of his end is dark as night, the sad face still retaining under the lines wrought by care something of its personal beauty and charm. Richard was but 34 years of age at death, appeared once more at the Tower. After the tragedy at Pontefract Castle, his corpse rested a single night in the Tower of London, exposed to view, doubtless before the altar of St. John's Chapel. His skull, by the way, has been submitted to modern examination. So we investigate ancient stories of murder nowadays, and it disproves the narrative of the violent blow at the hands of a Sir Piers of Exton. That Richard was starved to death is probable. The examination of Richard's poor skull had better justification than a similar inquiry conducted by Lord Nugent, who in 1828 opened John Hampden's grave to find whether the patriot's death at Chalgrave Field was due to a bullet wound in the shoulder, or, as one related, to an overloaded pistol having exploded and shattered his hand. That all doubts might be removed, the historical detail seems of small importance. He amputated both arms of the body with a penknife, and minutely examined them. Later, Lord Nugent acknowledged that he had reason to believe this outrage had been committed upon the wrong man. Anne Boleyn's fate was decided, not at Westminster, as was customary with all great state trials, but within the Tower, in the King's Hall. There has been much dispute concerning the particular apartment in which the court assembled. It is generally identified as one of the rooms on the middle floor of the keep, either the banqueting hall or the smaller chamber into which the visitor to the Tower emerges from St. John's Chapel, but others believe the Queen's trial to have been staged in the great hall of the Royal Palace, which seems likely. This long since was demolished. Both the upper state floor with the Council Chamber and the banqueting hall floor are now filled with collections of arms and armour, which for historical interest are unrivalled in England. The Armouries. They are the subject of a recent magnificent monograph by Mr. Charles Fowkes, F.S.A., curator of the Tower Armouries, published by the Stationery Office, and only one learned in armour is fitted to describe them. To that I make no pretence. The visitor cannot fail to notice how finely displayed are the figures bearing the armour. Knights in mail of the tilt yard riding horses heavily mailed, footmen in mail carrying pikes drawn up as if to start. I had a fancy one day of seeing the whole line in movement, horse and foot, marching with a clatter out of these halls and out of the Tower. What a spectacle that would make! Foot soldiers, however, were never completely covered in mail, as is seen in some unhorsed models here. The steel helmet and cuirass, continued in use by Cromwell's Ironsides, and, indeed, survive in the peace dress of our own Life Guards. This historical collection has its origin in that formed by King Henry VIII at Greenwich Palace, and many of the pieces were made as gifts to that monarch. Mr. Fowkes describes the central equestrian figure now exhibited in the Council Chamber, showing complete armour for horse and man, engraved with roses, pomegranates, portcullises, and other badges of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, as the finest example of the armourer's craft in existence. The armourer was Conrad Sessenhofer, one of a famous family of Augsburg smiths. The battle axes, or maces, have interested me. In the cases, lying side by side with maces of polished steel employed in the old days of the melee by knights in armour, will be found short, stout wooden staves, fitted with iron rings and knobs at the top, desperate weapons at close quarters. These were in actual use by our soldiers in the Great War of 1914-18, when making trench forays. So we have gone back in this respect, as in some others, to the simpler arms of the Middle Ages. One other exhibit, of peace and not of war, may be commended to Londoners' attention. It is the cresset or firepot, which the watchman carried high upon his shoulder about the city streets at night, bearing a coil of tarred rope that burnt with flame and much smoke and stink as he made his way into the darkness. This was the little light which the streets had centuries ago. But of course, the things that matter in the collections are the ring and plate armour and the wonderful display of military arms, from the ancient longbow of our famous archers, and the crossbow through all the stages of firearms. Prisoners in the Keep. In the Tower's early days, the upper state floors, reared so high that escape must have seemed impossible, were sometimes used as a state prison. There, Randolph Flammard, Bishop of Durham, the first prisoner, or first of any importance, that the Tower had held, was confined by King Henry I, and he is said to have got away by the little Norman window that has escaped the restorer's attentions, lowering himself by a rope to the ground. He had been too active in extorting taxes for building the fortress. Llewellyn's rebellious son, Griffith, later attempting to regain liberty by the same means, met with a terrible end, his body being found at the foot of the White Tower, with his head thrust in between his shoulders. The rope he had made from his linen had broken under his weight. The keep was also the prison of Charles of Orleans, the princely poet of France, taken by Henry V at Agincourt, alive amongst those left for slain, and perhaps the most romantic captive whom the Tower has immured. Joan of Arc considered him to be one of her country's chosen deliverers, believing that all would go well with France, and victory be hers, were his release obtained. His weary imprisonment ended in 1440, when Joan of Arc had suffered martyrdom at Rouen 9 years before. King John of France, captured at Poictiers, probably occupied these same chambers to which the wars of the English Edwards, on the Continent and at home, brought other captives. John de Balliol, King of the Scots, was one of these. On the main floor is the massive stone crypt below St. John's Chapel. The block therein exhibited, a gnarled piece of oak brown with oil and age, is that upon which Simon Fraser Lord Lovat suffered for participation in the Scottish Rebellion of 1745, the last man beheaded in England. 2 marks of the axe are clean cut upon its surface. The block was the possession, maybe the perquisite, of a former yeoman warder, John Poyden, who, when his own death was approaching, made a gift of it to the Tower. The headsman's axe shown at its side is of earlier date. A wall case contains a few instruments of torture, the thumbscrews, a spiked collar for prisoners, bilboes for securing captives by the feet, and that dreadful appliance, the scavenger's daughter, by which the victim was crushed, with head, hands, and feet secured, till, it is said, blood spurted from beneath his fingers. A lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Leonard Skeffington, has the dubious honour of this invention. There also is a model of the rack. Odd thing to place such a collection in a church crypt. The name there displayed, Sir Walter Raleigh's cell, is misleading. There is no evidence, and no likelihood, that any part of Raleigh's long captivity was spent in the keep. This is not a prison floor, but some of the followers of Wyatt's rebellion were thrust into this crypt. That it was used in Mary's reign for prisoners is evident from a few inscriptions carved on the wall. One of these reads, "He that endureth to the end shall be saved. M. 10. R. Rudston, Dar, Kent, Anno 1553. Another is, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. J. Fane, 1554. And there is also T. Culpepper of Darford. Originally the place was in total darkness, save possibly for a loophole opening. The window hacked out of the wall's thickness is modern. These carvings are at the side of a vaulted cell, 8 feet by 10 feet, now without a doorway. Its use is uncertain, but it is thought to have been a store place for treasure, protected by its own strong walls and the sanctity of the church. The dungeons. It is only of recent years that the dungeons have become accessible to the public, and to those who make the tour of the keep, they are the last chambers to be visited. The feeling as one first enters is that of disillusionment and disappointment. It is impossible here that it should be otherwise. The gloomy dungeon of one's imagination, cavernous, dark, deep, is a thing to peer into and with a shudder pass by. It can, of its nature, have no use. The proper way to go down into a dungeon is overworn, slippery stone stairs, with a flaming torch held high in hand, throwing fitful light into black recesses, dispersing a mist of smoke, an occasional choking sensation present in the throat, the consciousness of damp. That way I would go down to the dungeons of romance. One there is among the Tower's dungeons that even today tells its purpose, the subcrypt of St. John's Chapel. It is, in fact, the smallest of the three, but with its long vaulted barrel roof, the light glistening on the stones of walls and ceiling and earthen floor, and fading into indistinctness in the distance, bare, horribly bare, that dungeon I can imagine as it was when, in the medieval persecutions, scores of Jews were flung into it. All light then shut out, without ventilation, crowded. I can imagine the stagnant air from so many breaths, fetid as over a pool covered with green slime. But for the other dungeons, brightly illuminated throughout with the best electric lamps, stone paved, filled with cannon and mortar, exhibits of commanding interest which distract attention from the enclosing walls, they are as pleasant as is one's friend's wine cellar. No doubt all space in the Tower, so badly needed, has to be put to use. But I think that the authorities who gave to us the dungeons in their present guise had small historical sense. I would prefer them empty, and so dark that one must grope one's way about. But in fact, a good span before our time, their original character was largely destroyed by the building within them of the heavy brick abutments and arches that support the main floor above. The dungeons of the keep are level with the ground on the south side, and sunk only a few feet on the north, facts which should dispel some ridiculous legends concerning them. Fancy has played most freely about the Little Ease. Like the rest of the keep, the floor of the dungeons is divided by strong internal walls into 3 chambers, and Little Ease today is merely an arched passage through the thick division wall from one to another. On one side it can be closed by a heavy oak door still in position, and there are the spikes on which a door or wicket once swung on the other side. Guy Fawkes is the traditional prisoner walled in there. If ever it was used as a cell, of which there is some doubt, it was horrible enough, being cramped in space, black in its darkness, but to accentuate the shudders which the place should give, some morbid writers have pictured the muddy Thames waters flowing in, rising to the confined prisoner's waist, if not to his shoulders, before they subsided, and rendering him mad with terror. Not only is Little Ease above ground, but it stands some 16 feet above the river's high water mark. Could one look back to days when these actually were dungeons, their gloom would be found sufficient without exaggeration. There were no windows cut in the immense thickness of the walls. Without light and without ventilation, save such little as may have come down from above, they were as fetid and horrible as any delved deep in the earth. Yet into these places hundreds of victims were thrown, the guilty and the innocent together, by King John and others. In the year 1278 a horde of Jews, numbering 600 men and their families, were thrust in here, being accused of clipping and defacing the king's coin. Many, no doubt, perished in confinement. The first Edward's wars in Wales and Scotland brought other prisoners to London, whose lives rotted away in the Tower's dungeons. The place is said also to have served for the immurement of the sub-prior of St. Peter's, and a party of his monks, suspected by the same monarch, on good evidence, of being party to the forcing of the royal treasury at Westminster Abbey, and the robbery of the English Regalia and treasure stored there. Nor did the dungeon's use cease with the darkest years of the Middle Ages. The rack was kept here, where solid walls might stifle the cries of tortured victims from the outer world, and, worked by light of torture lantern, it was freely employed by Henry VIII and Great Elizabeth, and last used by James I. The western chamber is 91 feet long by 35 feet in width. The second dungeon measures 47 feet length by 15 feet breadth. The doorway cut in the north wall of the keep, through which the visitor emerges into the open air, is modern. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 3 The Traitors Gate. Happily, it is not necessary to regard the statements of our ancient English chroniclers as cold records of the facts of their times, or to dismiss them as worthless because they contain much that obviously cannot be accepted as strictly historical. They lived in an age of simpler faith than ours, when men's minds were more receptive to the marvellous and much more influenced by it. Their Latin was not always impeccable, but through the texts there exudes the glow of religious fervour. Too often for our liking, such facts as they dealt with were made subsidiary to the moral, for with few exceptions they were religious men of one brotherhood or another, clerks possessing the ability, rare in their age, to write. So I turn to Matthew Paris, the monk of St. Albans, for his story of the building of St. Thomas's Tower and the Traitors' Gate, with the assurance that, be his vision worth what it may, he tells us quite truthfully this, that the continuous growth and strength of the formidable fortress of the Tower was very unpopular with the Londoners, jealous of the personal power of their kings, and that woven into his story is something about the building to which we may profitably listen. The Tower Wharf, built out upon the Thames foreshore, which today affords so pleasant a view of the river's activities, the defending St. Thomas's Tower and the Watergate, our own Traitors' Gate, were all one work, and it was King Henry III who undertook it. The commonalty found cause and courage for protest. And then, on the night of St. George's Day of the year 1240, while the London populace was at prayer, Wharf and Watergate fell in. There was much significance in that. We might ourselves attribute such disaster to the scour of a high spring tide, but the citizens thought otherwise. Artificers took up the task afresh, but on the self-same St. George's night of the following year, a second time the work of masonry, stones, and earth crashed and slipped into the river. Matthew Paris tells that a priest then passing saw the ghostly figure of an archbishop, dressed in episcopal robes, holding his cross, and attended by the spirit of a clerk, gazing sternly on these new works. The figure spoke to the masons, asking, "Why build ye these?" Sharply he struck the walls with the Holy Cross, whereupon they reeled and sank into the tide, leaving a wreath of smoke behind. The priest was too much scared to accost the more potent spirit, but he turned to the humble clerk, asking the Archbishop's name. "St. Thomas of Canterbury," said the shade. To his further request why this destruction was done, the shade replied, "St. Thomas, by birth a citizen of London, mislikes these works because they are raised in scorn and against the public right. For this cause he has thrown them down beyond the tyrant's power to restore them." There is more, and incidentally the ghostly assurance that if St. Thomas had not acted, the confessor himself would have swept the building away. But what makes me think that a Becket's interference was interpolated into the story of destruction a little later is that Henry III, a pious king, the great builder of Westminster Abbey, and the especial devotee of the confessor, displayed no concern. Ghostly interference did not dismay him. Only he built more strongly than ever, and with such stability that his work stands. There's the wharf, and the Traitors Gate, and St. Thomas's Tower as evidence of it, though the last named, as we now see it, is largely Salvin's reconstruction half a century ago. But perhaps I am wrong, for notice the dedication of the guarding tower is to St. Thomas himself, and in the tower, by the side of his water gate, the king made a little oratory for religious devotions, also dedicated to the Canterbury martyr. Were these meant for appeasement of the unseen power? The keeper of the crown jewels today has pleasant quarters in St. Thomas's Tower, and there is an overhead way by which he may get to the Wakefield Tower, wherein the Regalia is safe kept, without going into open air. The Arch and Steps. The arch over the Traitors Gate is remarkable for its span, having no keystone. It extends 61 feet, and each stone of its lowest course is keyed into the next with a cog, space for which is cut out. So constructed, it stands strong, defying time and decay. The gates swing open, though water no longer comes up to them. An oaken latticework fills in the space to the arch. From the wall still hangs a large iron ring, to which the boats that have brought so many doomed men to the Tower from their trial at Westminster Hall tied up. What numbers of men and women whose memories bulk large in our history has this gate shut out from a world that should know them no longer? It has no stains of blood. Its associations are not those of the close walls of the Beauchamp and other towers, upon which imprisoned men have scratched a record of their name and fate for future ages to read, but the boats silently drifting in beneath this arch to the steps, the processional axe turned with its edge towards the condemned prisoner, have conveyed so much human anguish and despair as assuredly make this one of the saddest spots in this Tower of Sadness. The old steps that prisoners of state have trodden in the Tower's most momentous days are there. A modern stone and course of brick covers and protects each, but the ends of the old worn stones are left visible. Despite the inscriptions in so many books, it is probable that the greatest figure among the Tower's prisoners, Queen Elizabeth, then a young princess, did not land here upon that rainy Palm Sunday of 1554. The tide was found to be too low for the barge to reach the causeway. She sprang out on the mud, then threw herself down on a wet stone. "Better sit here than in a worse place," she remarked. All this suggests the more honourable entrance by the Queen's stairs. "I pray you all, good fellows and friends," Elizabeth said to the Tower guard, "bear me witness that I come in no traitor, but as true a woman to the Queen's Majesty as any now living, and thereon I will take my death. Captives at Traitors Gate. To the Traitors Gate, earlier, had come a queen, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. She was brought from Greenwich by water to the Tower, the 2nd May, 1536, the Lord Chancellor, the Duke of Norfolk, and others attending, and it was her prison during the remaining 17 days of life allowed to her. As the boat floated in to the steps, a strong guard assembled. It was a distracted woman who landed, and was there handed over to the constable. "Jesu, have mercy on me!" Anne Boleyn cried, and then she kneeled down, weeping a great space, and in the same sorrow fell into a great laughing, and so she did several times afterwards. It is all very human. We meet Anne Boleyn again in the King's house. It then was known as the Lieutenant's Lodgings, on the execution ground, and in the sad little church of St. Peter Ad Vincula within the Tower. There is a story of her ghost having appeared to the sentry placed in the night watch beneath her window. I have small faith in ghosts, but if such exist, be sure there is among the legions the shade of this pathetic queen, so much defamed, whose true character still remains so largely concealed in mystery that over it historians may haggle. Queen Catherine Howard entered by Traitors Gate. Archbishop Cranmer, to whom the Tower was but a resting place in his progress to the stake at Oxford, Sir Thomas Wyatt, the rebel against Queen Mary, the Earl of Essex, after the failure of his rising against Elizabeth, Strafford and Archbishop Laud, Monmouth, and many more. Late, for its use was then drawing towards a close, came the 7 bishops, sent to the Tower by King James II, and at their entrance a strange scene. They were brought by water from Westminster. The barge having passed through the Traitors' Gate, as they landed on the steps, the warders and guards knelt and implored their blessing. Soldiers and barracks cheered, and from the river came through the shouts and blessings of the populace which had accompanied them throughout their passage, all London being out to see them go by, mingling with the sound of St. Peter's bells ringing for evening service. More at the Tower. Standing in the narrow street of the Bailey between the outer and inner walls, looking toward the Traitors' Gate in its most familiar view, we may picture afresh one of those domestic and most human incidences which illuminate the last days of Sir Thomas More. He had walked from his prison to Westminster, feebly leaning upon a stick, and leaving Westminster Hall, after condemnation, was allowed to return to the Tower by water. His grandson writes in the Life of More: "When Sir Thomas was now come to the Tower wharf, his best beloved child, my Aunt Roper, desirous to see her father, whom she feared she should never see in this world after, to have his last blessing, gave there attendance to meet him, whom as soon as she had espised, she ran hastily unto him, and without consideration or care for herself, passing through the midst of the throng and guard of men, who with bills and halberts compassed him round, there openly in the sight of them, all embraced him, and took him about the neck and kissed him, not able to say any word but, 'O my father, O my father!' He, liking well her most natural and dear affection towards him, gave her his fatherly blessing, telling her that whatsoever he should suffer, though he were innocent, yet it was not without the will of God, and that he knew well enough all the secrets of her heart, counselling her to accommodate her will to God's blessed pleasure, and to be patient for his loss. She was no sooner parted from him, and had gone scarce 10 steps when she, not satisfied with the former farewell, like one who had forgot herself, ravished with the entire love of so worthy a father, having neither respect to herself nor to the press of the people about him, suddenly turned back and ran hastily to him, and took him about the neck, and divers times together kissed him, whereat he spoke not a word, but carrying still his gravity, tears fell also from his eyes. Yea, there were very few in all the troop who could refrain hereat from weeping, no, not the guard themselves. Yet at last, with a full heart, she was severed from him, at which time another of our women embraced him, and my aunt's maid, Dorothy Collis, did the like, of whom he said after, it was homely but very lovingly done. He passed in with the guard beneath the dark archway and portcullis of the Bloody Tower, and thence to the Bell Tower, which was his prison, only to emerge upon the scaffold. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Tower of London, by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 4. The Bell Tower. Sunset is made known to all whose residence or occupation is immediately about the Tower of London by the curfew. The custom is said to have been introduced to England from the Continent by William the Conqueror, who built this fortress, and there down to this day the curfew is rung out from the Bell Tower. That is a long link back. There is one other place in central London where it is sounded, but there the fixed hour is 9, and it is the lawyers of Gray's Inn who keep the tradition alive. Londoners en masse know neither one nor the other, and it would be a safe question to have asked of the majority whether the curfew still existed. A few years back I was amused by a correspondence in an archaeological paper about its survival, when remote hamlets and villages were instanced which keep the observance and honour from their churches' belfries. But then London is always big enough to be overlooked. The Bell Tower, sometimes, because of the association, called the Curfew Tower, is roughly circular. Many historians believe it to be one of the buildings put up by King Henry III when he was strengthening the fortress, though others have dated it as early as Richard I, and there is much to be said for the earlier date. The simple crudity of the structure suggests the lion-hearted king rather than the ornate builder of Westminster Abbey. It is immensely strong. The base itself is solid masonry, and the first arrow slits appear high above this, where the walls are many feet in thickness. Even at the windows far overhead, lighting the upper chamber, the walls are 8 feet thick. This strength was necessary, for the structure occupies an important position, being the corner fortification of the ballium wall enclosing the inner ward, and it would be the first turret to repel attack had entrance by the Byward Tower been forced. The slits enfilade the walls on either side, and from them a continuous flight of arrows could be discharged upon the soldiery hemmed in the narrow spaces below. Although rising 60 feet in height, the Bell Tower has but 2 stories or floors. It can be entered only through the Lieutenant's lodgings, the King's House of today, which extends east above the ballium wall. The enlarged modern windows and balcony of that building, giving an extensive view over the river and its passing traffic, have been placed there for the convenience of the resident Major of the Tower, who nowadays occupies these historical quarters. Sir Thomas More. The tower takes its name from the little wooden turret on the summit, where still the bell is hung. This was the alarm bell of the fortress, performing this service as well as giving the curfew. As a place of great strength, and being also under the immediate supervision of the lieutenant, who commanded the sole means of access and exit, the bell tower was frequently chosen as the place of immurement of important prisoners of state. The lower chamber is a stone vaulted cell, the ribs square and without ornament, though there are remains of ancient circular shafts and capitals. Light enters only through the narrow piercings of the wall. This was the prison of Sir Thomas More, and for a time the aged Bishop Fisher was confined in the apartment above him, till both in turn passed out to the block on Tower Hill. When More was committed to the Tower, the yeoman porter there, privileged by custom, demanded of him his upper garment. "Mr. Porter," quoth he, "here it is," and took off his cap and delivered it to him, saying, "I am very sorry it is no better for thee." "No, sir," quoth the porter, "I must have your gown," and so was he by the lieutenant conveyed to his lodging. More's quaint humour, irrepressible even when he reached the scaffold, survived the months spent in this dreary place. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower and his old friend, did his best to lodge him decently, expressing a trust that his prisoner would accept his goodwill and such poor cheer as he had. "I do not mislike my cheer, but whensoever I so do, then thrust me out of your doors," More answered. In this cell, not lacking in space, though poorly lit, More wrote books of comfort against tribulation, a treatise on the Sacrament, and was engaged upon his unfinished Our Lord's Passion. His family biographers, who, in devout spirit, have recorded his full life, state that when he came to expound the words, "And they laid hands upon him and held him," More was deprived of his books, ink, and paper, so could write no further. It was an immeasurable loss. Thereafter he darkened the few points through which light could enter, and sat through the hours in meditation, replying when questioned, "When all the wares are gone, the shop windows are to be shut up." No doubt a sufficient reason for this deprivation was the discovery of his clandestine correspondence with Fisher, though More, under examination, denied that any writing had passed. Fisher's last hours. Above, the strong room, so called, makes the whole story. This is a circular stone chamber, 18 feet across, with conical roof and lighted by 4 windows, the chief prison of the bell tower. It is spacious and airy, and perhaps the best prison room in all the Tower of London, repellent only in its chilling stone and assertion of unconquerable strength. Fisher, while there, complained piteously of its cold, which must have been terrible in winter for one of his advanced years, so infirm that he trembled already at the grave's brink. On a December day, in 1534, he wrote to Cromwell to move the King's favour to release him out of this cold and painful imprisonment. "I beseech you to be good, master, unto me in my necessity, for I have neither shirt nor suit, nor yet other clothes that are necessary for me to wear, but that be ragged and rent to shamefully. Notwithstanding, I might easily suffer that, if thou would keep my body warm. But my diet also, God knoweth how slender it is at many times, and know in mine age, my stomach may not away but with a few kinds of meats, which if I want, I decay forthwith, and fall into coughs and diseases of my body, and cannot keep myself in health. And as our Lord knoweth, I have nothing left unto me for to provide any better, but as my brother of his own purse layeth out for me to his great hindrance. Wherefore, good master, Secretary F. Stones, I beseech you to have some pity upon me, and let me have such things as are necessary for me and mine age, and specially for my health. In this prison room Fisher was awakened on the 22nd June, 1535, to learn that he must die that morning at 9. He asked the hour. It was 5. "Let me by your patience," he said to the lieutenant, "sleep an hour or two, for I've slept very little this night, and yet, to tell truth, not from any fear of death, I thank God, but by reason of my great weakness and infirmity." He fell asleep again very soundly for 2 hours. That sleep of old Fisher's, putting aside all fear of death, valuing as nothing 4 hours of life before eternity, is among the human incidents which lighten the sombre records of the Tower. Princess Elizabeth. It is traditional that Queen Elizabeth, when a young princess, was an occupant of the same prison room, after committal by her reigning sister, to the Tower. Her health suffering, she was allowed the liberty of the walls and the Tower gardens. A little door from the bell tower gives entry upon the high rampart that extends at the top of the ballium wall to the Beauchamp Tower. For a time since the memory of man knoweth not to the contrary, it has been known as Princess Elizabeth's Walk. Heywood tells a charming story, that as Elizabeth was walking in the Privy Garden, the little daughter of one of the Tower officers, having found some small desk or cupboard keys, innocently took them to the Princess, saying that now she had the keys, she could unlock the gates and go abroad. Other children of the warders walked and talked with her while she took recreation, lightening the monotony of the hours. Of Elizabeth's 2 months' captivity in the Tower a good deal is known. She proved a discontented and somewhat troublesome prisoner. At moments she feared immediate execution, and even suggested that she might be dispatched, like her mother, by the French headsman's sword. The royal palace was then standing, and the late Mr. Richard Davy, a careful historian, has pointed out good reasons for belief that that was her prison, for at least the more humane stages of her confinement. When Elizabeth entered the Tower, 4 rooms were set aside for herself and her attendants. She was given liberty to walk in the Queen's lodging. In the Bedingfield papers, mention is made of a great chamber next to the Princess's, in which she was allowed to walk. There is no other large room in the belfry. If, indeed, the bell tower ever received the great Queen, it was probably after the measures taken for her greater security, for there she would be always under the Lieutenant's watchful eyes, and the stone chamber would no doubt have been made habitable with such comfort as Sir John Bridges, the Lieutenant, was able to provide. Other prisoners. The strong room was not misnamed. High, forbidding, it held secure. It is reached by narrow passages from the King's house, of which the whole bell tower forms, as it were, a corner turret. Near the door is a much defaced inscription, cut in the wall by the Bishop of Ross, who was committed a prisoner there in Elizabeth's reign. The bell tower, great as is its interest, is not made available to the public, nor can it be while the Tower of London remains a garrisoned place, the means of access being as they are. If other arrangements at some time become possible, this undoubtedly is one of the towers where the privilege of admission would be greatly valued. Lady Arabella Stuart, a first cousin of King James I, and also related to the Tudors, and therefore doubly dangerous as an aspirant to the throne, was a prisoner in the bell tower, where her sad and harmless life ended in madness. Lady Catherine Seymour, the sister of Lady Jane Grey, and a victim of Elizabeth's fury, another. Therein her son was born, the infant whose destiny it was to be baptized in St. Peter Ad Vincula, where beneath the floor his nearest relatives, all having perished by the axe, lay in nameless graves. The times were pitiless that could condemn women of gentle birth to immurement here, where to live celled within these 8-foot walls must have seemed to be walled up alive. The last occupant of note was John Thelwall, the Reformer, in 1794, who had the good fortune to secure an acquittal. That was unlike the majority of those held captive in the Tower of London on charges of treason. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 5 St. Peter Ad Vincula. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery, wrote Lord Macaulay of the sheltered chapel of St. Peter Ad Vincula within the Tower. Death is there associated not, as in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, with genius and virtue, with public veneration and with imperishable renown, not, as in our humblest churches and churchyards, with everything that is most endearing in social and domestic charities, but with whatever is darkest in human nature and in human destiny, with the savage triumph of implacable enemies, with the inconsistency, the ingratitude, the cowardice of friends, with all the miseries of fallen greatness and of blighted fame. Thither have been carried through successive ages, by the rude hands of jailers, without one mourner following, the bleeding relics of men who have been the captains of armies, the leaders of parties, the oracles of senates, and the ornaments of courts. Stillness broods over the chapel. They lie in close company, side by side, in the small space before the altar, which is raised a foot above the level of the floor, a few yards of earth covering the relics of men and women who in their day had been these splendid figures, all violently cut off in their prime. It covers the relics of 2 English queens. The sound of a footfall seems an intrusion here. Occasionally muffled, the sharp word of command and the tramp of soldiers drilling on the parade ground enters, reminding one that this is a fortress chapel. One stands silent before these dead, when thoughts run back, and the mind is filled with the large part which they in their lives have played, filling out so many pages of our history, and the idea seems grotesque that this tiny plot should hold all. A carpet would shelter it. They have no monument, not even the scratching of a name or initials upon the tiles, till in our own time this little service was done. Others of less note in the world's judgment have monuments about the church. The eye turns for relief to the sculptured figures of officers of the Tower in Elizabethan ruff, and inscriptions of soldiers and divines buried within the walls, but a plain flat pavement covers all this tragedy of England's history. They were rudely coffined who lie below. Anne Boleyn, fallen from her splendour and brought to this end in 17 days, was thrust after execution into an elm chest, made and used for arrows, and so buried. And others were hurried below ground as little ceremoniously. Graves before the altar. There lieth before the high altar in St. Peter's Church 2 dukes between 2 queens, is old John Stow's simple record. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, is one of these, the man whose vaulting ambition brought Lady Jane Grey to the same chapel. Somerset is his fellow, one of 2 brothers, the elder protector of the realm of England, during the minority of the boy King Edward VI, the younger Thomas Seymour, Lord Seymour of Sudeley and Lord High Admiral of England, both beheaded, both after the quarrels of their intriguing lives finding rest in this same earth. Queen Catherine Howard is companion in sepulture to Anne Boleyn, and a third I would add to this royal company of queens, Jane the Queen, though hers was but a 9 days' reign. Monmouth, who by an armed rising struck out for a crown, was placed actually beneath the altar. In the armoury within the keep you may see scythe blades used in the harvest field, roughly nailed upon poles, which served as weapons for the poor peasants of Sedgemoor, inveigled into support of his cause. Robert Devereux, the handsome Earl of Essex, Elizabeth's favourite, and a rebel against the great Queen to whom he owed all, is with 2 representatives of the long line of the Dukes of Norfolk, and the aged Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, is another. She would not bend her grey head to the headsman's stroke. "So should traitors do, and I am none," she protested. 15 in all lie in this hallowed ground about the altar, with Monmouth apart in a double row 6 feet in depth, with 2 feet 6 inches width for each, 18 feet by 12 feet. That is enough. The axe has harvested all, save only Sir Thomas Overbury, whose mysterious end in the Tower was due to poison. Philip, Earl of Arundel, dying in imprisonment, was buried here. His body was later removed to the chapel at Arundel. Where else in the wide world does so little space hold so much, telling so poignantly of the end of all human grandeur? This plot before the altar was reserved for the most distinguished victims of state. Royal or noble blood would seem to have been the requisite for admission there. But the chapel has given its shelter in nameless graves to many others whose part upon the world's stage has won for them in perhaps greater measure the veneration and awe, and sometimes even the contempt, of posterity. There is a list of 34 names on a modern memorial tablet by the entrance door. The good Sir Thomas More was brought here from Tower Hill for burial, and Bishop Fisher, condemned like him for denial of the spiritual supremacy of King Henry VIII, was laid by his side, the 2 martyrs for faith among a large company whom alone the chapel holds. Laud, an object of Puritan hate, though beheaded on Tower Hill, never rested here. Some said, as he came out to execution, that he had painted his face that morning purple. But the standers-by were hushed into sudden awe on seeing that purple face turn ghastly white. Somewhere this enriched earth has mixed with the dust of Thomas Cromwell, himself the victim of that ruthless statecraft which at his bidding had brought so many to the block, the stake, and the gibbet. Surely he among them all must lie most uneasily. The Duke of Suffolk, Lady Jane Grey's father, when all was lost, shared her fate and burial in St. Peter's, though his head is said, on somewhat dubious authority, to be that gruesome relic now preserved under glass in the church of St. Botolph, Aldgate. Footnote: I have told the curious story of this head with some detail in Unknown London. End footnote. Guilford Dudley, Lady Jane's youthful husband, rests before the altar by his wife's side. The parliamentarian, Sir John Eliot, one whose fame is pure and serene, died a prisoner in the Tower, and in this chapel his remains were laid. "No stone," says his biographer, "marks the spot, but as long as freedom continues he will not be without a monument." Many more there are, famous or infamous in story, who after life's fitful fever sleep. Jeffreys, the Lord Chief Justice, one feels glad has been removed from a company that his execrated memory dishonours, and now his body reposes in his family vault at the City Church of St. Mary Aldermanbury. Closing the long roll are the 3 rebel lords of the 45, Prince Charlie's fruitless effort to seize the throne of Scotland and England. Kilmarnock and Balmerino alone had their stone marked by a peculiar sign which puzzled all who attempted to decipher its meaning, until at the renovation of the chapel in 1876 their coffins were found below. It is a shaft with 2 rings, and presumably the lozenge was added when that sly old fox, Simon Fraser Lord Lovat, the last man beheaded in England, joined their company. Sir Simon de Burghley, in King Richard II's reign, had been the first to perish on Tower Hill by the more honourable death of the axe. Simon's both. The stone, close by the door, you almost step upon when entering the chapel. The cutting is slowly undergoing obliteration by many passing feet. Leaden coffin plates of the Jacobite lords, inscribed with names, styles and ages, are exhibited on the adjacent wall. Till the renovations carried out by Queen Victoria, when the galleries added by George II and the high-backed pews were removed, the church was in a deplorable state of neglect. Its floor had sunk in many places, and the walls were covered with whitened plaster and the roof concealed, conditions well justifying Lord Macaulay's expression of disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into the likeness of a meeting-house in a manufacturing town. That is now all changed. There is nothing to exasperate or jar the sense with any feeling of pain. An army chaplain is always the pastor, and the cure is much sought after, for the opportunities it gives for work and study. Christmas and Easter are the chapel's great days. Easter Day. St. Peter's, setting aside its memories of sadness, then takes festal array. The Tower warders, the full corps, don their full-dress uniforms of the King's bodyguard of the Yeomen of the Guard, with the ruff and silk stockings and big rosettes to the shoes. Bearing their halberts, they attend the Governor and Major of the Tower in state, from the King's house to this place of worship. The chief yeoman warder carries the Tower mace, the tall shaft surmounted by a pretty model in old silver of the Norman keep. Church plate is brought for the special occasion from the Regalia. The warders surround the Governor himself in general's full dress. They sit, a blaze of scarlet and gold and steel, within the grey walls, with the khaki of the military garrison around, and the sombre attire of such of the public as may have gained admission. That is the picture made. It is a moving service, the hymns sung lustily by so many men's voices, in a church which is unique for its historical associations. King John, or it may have been an earlier monarch, established the chapel of St. Peter Ad Vincula in the Tower, St. Peter in chains. At the church of S. Pietro in Vinculi at Rome, to this day, the chains of the saint each year are exhibited to the faithful on August 1. The chapel at least has mention in King John's time, and is likely to have been built over the detached crypt to which the human remains removed from below the floor of the nave and aisle have been committed. The chapel as we know it owes its origin to King Edward I, but in its present state is largely the work of King Henry VIII, who, after a survey of the Tower had been made, and a report drawn up, spent considerable sums upon it. The fine chestnut roof now disclosed is his, and the arches and the windows, except that over the west entrance door, are of that period. Of the 2 altars, The chief was dedicated to St. Peter. The other, in the north aisle, was in honour of the Virgin, and there is a hagioscope, or squint, cut through the wall, to enable the priest there officiating to observe the high altar. The monument at the head of the single aisle is that of Sir Richard Cholmondeley, Lieutenant of the Tower in the reign of King Henry VII, and bears recumbent life-size effigies in alabaster of the knight and his wife Elizabeth. It has been opened, but was found to contain no human remains, nothing beyond fragments of the old stone font that were packed within it. That the couple were buried elsewhere is made the more likely from the date of death having been left blank. No doubt Sir Richard and the Lady Elizabeth gained satisfaction from gazing upon their effigies when often they worshipped here. Field Marshal Sir John Fox Burgoyne, Constable of the Tower, was the last person to be buried in the chapel, in 1871. For a long period St. Peter Ad Vincula was not accessible to visitors to the Tower except by written permission specifically obtained, a restriction the sense of which I could never understand. Happily, the authorities having charge of the fortress today have found more enlightenment, and when a warder can be spared from other duty, he is at liberty to take visitors over. It is probably little known that any worshipper among the public may attend the garrison service at this historic church at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, and indeed will be welcomed. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 6. Bloody Tower and Regalia. The Bloody Tower, square and menacing, its old stones dark with age and weathered, defends the one low arch and narrow causeway which gave admission to the inner ward. Immediately opposite is the Traitors Gate. The prisoner of state landed there had but a few steps to cross, and once through this portal, the black portcullis lowered behind him, which still shows its jagged teeth, he was held doubly secured. The cobblestones have rung to the feet of men famous in power and in adversity. Through this archway, wrote Lord Ronald Sutherland Gower, have passed all the state prisoners that the old fortress has drawn into its grim maw. Prelates, queens and princes, statesmen, judges, courtiers, and soldiers of all degrees, the patriot willing to lay down his life for the old cause, as Algernon Sidney called his policy, and the favourite of some fickle royal master, thrown aside and allowed to perish by a Henry, an Elizabeth, or a Charles. For 5 centuries this old tower has seen pass beneath its black walls many who have helped to make the history of our race. This pathway has been their via crucis. Look up, when through the arch, to the little square window directly above its point. When warders had used the Bloody Tower for their quarters, a box of homely flowers lightened the sill with colour, and a caged bird sang from the wall. That was the window through which Laud fated himself to die by the axe 3 years later, extended his hands to give the last blessing to Strafford as that statesman passed beneath to execution on Tower Hill. Then he fell back fainting into the arms of his servants. "I hope by God's assistance," murmured the Archbishop, "and mine own innocency, that when I come to my own execution, I shall show the world how much more sensible I am of my Lord Strafford's loss than I am of my own." Memories cluster about the Bloody Tower as thickly as anywhere within the fortress. It is small as it is strong, and crimes have been committed within its walls, by dagger and poison and harsh imprisonment unduly prolonged, that well justify the forbidding name it has borne these 3 centuries past and more. Mingling curiosity with them are literary associations we can ill afford to spare. Raleigh and Eliot. Sir Walter Raleigh spent 13 years of captivity here, and beguiled some of the tedium of the hours by writing in the Bloody Tower his noble fragment of the History of the World. In the one ample chamber that the Bloody Tower contains, when last I passed through, a copy of the book had been placed on exhibition, there where it was written, and a wreath for reminder. It is Raleigh's walk that extends along the ballium wall from this tower towards the Lieutenant's lodgings, which formerly it must have joined. The little liberty he was allowed after close immurement had brought to his strong frame the agonies of rheumatism and palsy. In his time, the Bloody Tower had alternatively the better name of the Garden Tower, and in the garden house near by he conducted his scientific experiments. Sir John Eliot, the undaunted parliamentarian, was a later prisoner, dying of consumption in a cold and draughty cell. The oratory that had moved his fellow countrymen being thus effectually silenced, he wrote here 3 of his books: The Monarchy of Men, Jure Magistratus, and his Apology for Socrates. Let him be buried in the parish in which he died, was Charles I's pitiless reply to the relatives who desired his body. And so it is that the patriot rests with the sorrowful company in the church of St. Peter Ad Vincula within the Tower. The literary associations of the Tower of London would be sadly incomplete without mention of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, though evidence is wanting to tell in what turret he was confined. The great Quaker was brought there for having published a pamphlet called A Sandy Foundation Shaken, which bigots of the time considered blasphemous, and while in imprisonment he wrote his No Cross, No Crown, the most enduring of his religious writings. Martyrs for Faith. The visitor enters the Bloody Tower at the floor above the archway, where is the windlass for raising and lowering the portcullis that can still be worked. It is worth noting, for there are but 1 or 2 others authentic in England. This place seems but a small passage, but when many captives had to be accommodated, it was used as a windowless cell. The one large prison room, stone paved, is on the left, and opens high to the roof, for the floor above, which no doubt spread right across, has been carried away in all but a small portion. Archbishop Cranmer was confined in the Bloody Tower, in all probability in this chamber, and there in Queen Mary's reign, when London was stocked full with prisoners, so that even the city churches were utilized as places for immurement, Latimer and Ridley were brought to keep his company, and in converse they strengthened one another in theological convictions. All 3 passed out to die at the stake at Oxford. Felton, the fanatical assassin of the Duke of Buckingham, favourite of 2 monarchs, was held fast in the Bloody Tower. A later Duke of Buckingham was himself 5 times a prisoner in London's fortress. Later still there came here the infamous Chief Justice Jeffreys, saved from lynching by an angry mob after a law clerk had recognized his unforgettable face peering out of the window of a low alehouse at Wapping. he spent his last miserable days in this place of gloom, and there died. If walls could speak, the Bloody Tower would tell many a tale of terror. There Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, who had fallen under Elizabeth's severe disfavour, met his mysterious end. Suicide in dread of execution as a traitor, and to save his estates from confiscation, was the explanation given out. His personal servants had been removed and a stranger sent. In dead of night was raised a hue and cry. Sir Owen Hopton, the Lieutenant of the Tower, going to the chamber, found the Earl lying dead, stretched beneath the clothes, and on pulling them down saw the bed soaked with blood from repeated dagger thrusts in the left breast. That circumstance and others suggest, not suicide, but the midnight assassin. At any rate, there was no need for trial. Sir Thomas Overbury, confined in the Bloody Tower, died there from slow poison mixed with his food. Arsenic, cantharides, lunar caustic, mercury, powdered diamonds, all were employed, if the statements afterwards made by those condemned for the sordid business can be credited. And these failing, a clyster finally relieved the poor gentleman of the burden of life. A courtier of King James I, he was the victim of a most tangled plot. Incidentally, it cost Sir Gervase Elwes, or Helwis, the Lieutenant of the Tower, his life, for he was hanged on Tower Hill for his willing participation in the affair, not the only lieutenant so to suffer, for the Royalists, on their return with Charles II, made similar short work of Berkstead, who had filled the office under the Parliament. Little princes murdered. Of course, all these associations of the Bloody Tower pale before the pitiable tragedy committed there in 1483, to which is ascribed the name which this building of ill omen bears. It was the place of the murder of the little princes, the boy King Edward V, 12 years of age, and his younger brother, the Duke of York. Long tradition points out the small room to which the visitor passes on the floor above as the actual scene of the crime. A dark stone staircase, circular and so narrow that one at a time only can pass, goes up to it. There is another means of gaining entrance, by Raleigh's Walk, onto which the visitor steps when leaving the Tower. Here, along the top of the ballium wall, the murderers, Dighton, Forrest, and Slater, stealthily approached, forcing a way into the room, and finding the boy sleeping, they suffocated one. The other, waking, was dispatched with a dagger. The bodies were hastily committed to earth by the basement of the adjoining Wakefield Tower, and afterwards removed, Sir Thomas More says, to consecrated ground, they being king's sons. But the site of the burial was long a mystery, for Sir Robert Brackenbury, the Constable of the Tower, was killed at Bosworth Field, and the priest who conducted the secret interment had died. In excavations by the south wall of the keep, at the foot of the stairs, in King Charles II's reign, the bones of 2 young boys were found together a foot or 2 below the surface. Believing these to be the remains of the ill-fated princes, that monarch had them removed to Westminster Abbey, where they now lie. The guilt of that black crime history has placed to the infamy of King Richard III, and the judgment will stand, despite the efforts of some recent writers to rehabilitate his tarnished character. By one of these we are asked to believe that the boys died natural, if convenient, deaths. The Regalia. The Wakefield Tower flanking, and the Bloody Tower built above and about the arch, defend the one historical entrance to the Inner Ward. The Wakefield Tower has almost lost its identity in the crown jewels contained within it, yet should command its own interest. An English king, Henry VI, was murdered therein. It is among the earliest buildings of the Tower of London. On the other hand, the Regalia makes no claim to antiquity. Nothing is really ancient except the ampulla, or golden eagle, which holds the anointing oil used at a coronation, and the spoon into which the oil is poured, and with them the Black Prince's ruby worn in the front of the King's state crown. The city churches, and some few among the city companies, can boast possession of examples of the goldsmiths' and silversmiths' work of greater age than the Regalia, the product of skilled craftsmen of King Edward VI and Elizabeth. That is because there was civil war in this country, and King Charles I pledged and disposed of a good deal of the crown jewels and plate to provide funds for the Royalist forces. And the Parliament, once secure in authority, seized and sold the remainder. When King Charles II returned to take the throne, he found everything wanting, and went to his goldsmith, Sir Robert Vyner, to fit him out with regalia, like others might ask to be fitted out with a suit. Vyner did so, for £32,000, advancing the money himself. The ampulla, forgotten, or by chance hidden in the treasure house at Westminster Abbey, escaped the despoilers, as did the spoon in the same place, both being ecclesiastical plate. But how the Black Prince's ruby has survived, even Major General Sir George Younghusband, who not only is keeper of the crown jewels, but the greatest living authority upon them, does not know. It went up at the Commonwealth auction, a cheap lot at £4, the sum paid for the gem. Whether it fell to a Royalist, revering it for the association with the dethroned monarchy, or to a Parliament man who took it at a bargain price and returned it to the Regalia at a gorgeous profit, none can now tell. But the ruby found its way back to King Charles II at the Restoration, and is prized among the jewels. Crowns went cheap at this astonishing sale, these being some priced items in the inventory. Footnote: Younghusband, The Jewel House, pages 97 to 99. End footnote. King Alfred's crown, of gold wire with small stones, weight 79½ ounces, at £3 per ounce, £248, 10 sovereign. A small crown, apparently the crown of King Edward VI, £73, 16 sovereign, 8d. The gold, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, etc. of above, £355. Queen Edith's crown, formerly thought massy gold, found to be silver gilt, with garnets, pearls, sapphires, odd stones, £16. Large glass cup, wrought in figures, actually the agate chalice of Edward the Confessor, £102, 5 sovereign. 2 sceptres with pearls and gems and gold, £65, 16 sovereign, 10½d. Coronation robes were cheaper still, sold for an old song. 1 robe laced with gold lace, 10 sovereign. 1 robe of crimson taffety, 5 sovereign. 1 pair of buckskins, cloth of silver and silver stockings, very old, 2 sovereign, 6d. 1 pair of gloves embroidered with gold, 1 sovereign. 3 swords with scabbards of cloth of gold, £3. 1 liver-coloured silk robe, very old, and worth nothing. Of course, there have been many editions since Charles II, and the British Regalia today by far outvalues that of any other monarchy. To the famous Koh-i-Noor has in recent years been added the still larger Cullinan diamond. The King's State Crown contains between 5,000 and 6,000 separate jewels. The great gems, treasured merely because they are vulgarly big, may appeal to many people. All are to be seen in this unique collection, but some will derive greater satisfaction from the gold and silver plate. There are many excellent examples of the skilled craftsman's work since Carolean times. The sovereigns' crowns are 3 in number. 1. The Crown of England, or Edward the Confessor's crown, which is a replica made for Charles II on the lines of the historic crown earlier destroyed. 2. The State Crown, made for Queen Victoria, and but slightly altered by the 2 succeeding monarchs, but containing historical jewels, the Black Prince's ruby, Queen Elizabeth's pearls, and others. And 3. The Imperial Indian Crown, mostly set with diamonds, and with a few very large emeralds and rubies, which was manufactured in London for King George V. His Majesty was crowned with it Emperor of India in the year 1912. There are besides the smaller Queen's crowns. In the surfeit of blazing riches which is the Regalia, one looks with contentment upon a simple diadem. It is not really a crown. That King James II made a gift to his Queen, Mary of Modena. The designer has produced a headgear of real artistic merit, a thing impossible, apparently, with the ordinary bejewelled crown. Large pearls form a continuous row beneath the crimson velvet cap, topping a broad circlet of gold, the latter being enclustered with diamonds displayed in an effective figuring. Nothing else so attractive is in the collection of crowns. Orb, sceptres, plate, all are there. But I can imagine a sensitive person running away with something like horror from the garish glitter contained within the steel cage of the Wakefield Tower. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Tower of London, by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 7. The Beauchamp Tower. Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, himself a builder of Warwick Castle, was committed to this tower in 1397. It was a characteristic but not a kingly act of Richard II to invite him to a banquet, then have him arrested at the board and clapped into this stronghold. If treachery there was, then it was on both sides. Altogether, his imprisonment in the Tower of London lasted little more than a 12-month, and he regained his liberty in the triumph of Henry of Bolingbroke. Warwick was not a great figure, either for strength of character or for achievement, and his chief remembrance is that he gave his name to the Beauchamp Tower. It became in Tudor times the principal prison of the Tower of London, for which purpose it was well suited. its substantial masonry made quite safe anyone committed to its keeping. Looking up the bailey, by which he may not pass, the visitor sees the bold tower projecting outwards in a half circle with battlemented roof. That side is here illustrated. More familiar is the aspect from Tower Green, to which it presents a flat front, with entrance deeply sunk in the ground. There, at any rate, the glamour of the old walls survives, though the large window is Salvin's innovation last century. The cross window is of the age of Edward III, to whom the entire building is attributed. Till Queen Victoria's reign, this view of the Beauchamp Tower was blocked from sight by decaying tenements built up against it, and chimney shafts raised against the ancient walls, so little did our forefathers venerate the historic Tower of London. The chief prison chamber is on the first floor, but the apartments above, now occupied by a warder, were used for the same purpose. That in days when the Tower of London was crowded with captives, the basement also was utilized for immurement, is evident from the inscriptions still remaining there. Peveril, cut into the stone, with a shield and the device of a crucifix with a bleeding heart in the centre, excites interest. It is said to have suggested the name to Scott for his novel, though of this Peveril prisoner nothing is known. Marmaduke Neville, a plotter for Mary Queen of Scots in Elizabeth's reign, also has left his name. These two graphites are to be found above. A narrow winding stair is the sole means of communication with each floor, from ground to roof, and it is on the first floor that the visitor finds himself entirely absorbed with the records that so many hapless prisoners confined here have made. They are of varying quality, but some, like that illustrated opposite, have great artistic merit. Carvings by prisoners. The walls are covered with inscriptions. First to arrest attention is the elaborate carving and rebus of the 5 Dudley brothers, a family fated to greatness or misfortune. The block, ere this inscription was cut, had already claimed one. Another rose to be Elizabeth's magnificent Earl of Leicester. The carver himself, condemned as a traitor against Queen Mary, but reprieved, died in this prison. The central object of the design is the Dudley crest, a bear and a lion, deeply cut in bold relief, supporting the ragged staff. This is contained within a frame composed of garlands of roses, gillyflowers, honeysuckle, and oak sprigs with acorns. 4 lines of poetry set out beneath are these: You that these beasts do well behold and see, may deem with ease wherefore here made they be, with borders eke wherein 4 brothers' names who list to search the ground. With ease, the rebus certainly has not been read, for it has puzzled the brains of a great many people. The 3rd line was left unfinished, and one can only speculate what was intended. The Rev. R. Dick, in his monograph on this tower, has suggested reading into the blank space the words, "There may be found." This gives a reason for and explanation of the carving, and is probable. The rose is believed to stand for Robert Dudley, the gillyflower for Guilford, the acorn for Ambrose, and the honeysuckle for Henry. John Dudley has his name shown, and there can be little doubt that he was the carver. All 5 brothers were incarcerated in the Beauchamp Tower. Guilford, the husband of Lady Jane Grey, before his young life was cut short on Tower Hill. John, Earl of Warwick, had assisted the ambitious Northumberland in placing on the throne the hapless Queen of the 9 days' reign, hence the savage sentence passed upon him and his end here. The others went free. Away at a little distance is one of the most pathetic of the inscriptions. It is the single word, Jane. Lady Jane Grey was never held prisoner in the Beauchamp Tower, and this is supposed to have been carved by her youthful husband during the days of his captivity. Among the many these walls have confined was the unfortunate Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel. Elizabeth's age permitted no freedom to Roman Catholics, and Howard, seeking abroad what was denied to him in his own land, was seized in the Channel and brought to the Tower, where he lingered for 8 years after sentence of death, knowing that any day he might be called out for execution. His father and 2 ancestors of his line had suffered at the block, and his own fate seemed always near. His last gaoler was Sir Michael Blunt, the lieutenant whose fine monument is in St. Peter Ad Vincula, blocking up the hagioscope. This man's brutality Arundel reproved upon his deathbed, saying to him, "When a prisoner comes hither to this tower, he bringeth sorrow with him. Then do not add affliction to affliction. Your commission is only to keep with safety, not to kill with severity." A Latin inscription cut by the Earl, and now above the fireplace, reads, "The more suffering for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the next. Thou hast crowned him with honour and glory, O Lord. In memory everlasting he will be just." Arundel, June 22, 1587. The prisoners were not all noble, nor even important. Charles Bailey has left several graphites, obviously having found consolation in carving them. He was concerned in one of many plots to free Mary Queen of Scots from captivity, and was seized by Elizabeth's officers while carrying treasonable correspondence. Worldly wisdom came late, and he has thus moralized on his prison wall, IHS 1571, Die Ipralis. Wise men ought circumspectly to see what they do, to examine before they speak, to prove before they take in hand, to beware whose company they use, and above all things to whom they trust. Charles Bailey. Other precepts by him are, "The most unhappy man in the world is he that is not patient in adversities. For men are not killed with the adversities they have, but with the impatience which they suffer. The sighs are the true testimonies of my anguish. Last, hope to the end and have patience." An Irishman, Thomas Mayog, though he had had experience of Elizabeth's torturers, was more hardy in expression of his sentiments. "Thomas Mayog, which lieth here alone, that fain would from hence be gone. By torture strange my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied." In all, there are 91 inscriptions on these walls. A few do not belong to this tower, but have been brought from others where decay has required restoration, and so carefully preserved. But these few apart, all are the handiwork of prisoners who crowded the Beauchamp Tower in Tudor days. In the majority, plotters against the state, though often, as Bailey's carvings show, the poor tools of others highly placed. Thomas Clarke, 1576, has left 2 in rhyme. I leave in hope, and I give credit to my friend, in time did stand me most in hand. So would I never do again, except I had him sever in hand. And to all men wish I so, unless ye sustain the leak loose as I do. Unhappy is that man whose acts doth procure the misery of this house and prison to endure. The second runs, Hit is the point of a wise man to try and then trust, for happy is he whom findeth one that is just. One T. Salmon, a late comer, for he dates his carving 1622, has cut in the stone his coat of arms of 3 salmon, with a star and a death's head, and 3 short precepts in Latin, and above the record of his imprisonment, Close prisoner, 8 months, 32 weeks, 224 days, 5,376 hours. Closely he must have counted the hours. A carving of a bell bearing the letter A, with Thomas above, is an easily read rebus for Thomas Abel, Queen Catherine of Aragon's chaplain. An unhappy man, William Tyrrell, prisoner in 1541, utters in Italian his despair to the unresponsive stone. Since fortune has chosen to scatter my hopes to the wind, I wish my time were ended, my planet being ever sad and unfortunate. Others are brief. Grief is overcome by patience. G. Grifford, August 8, 1586. An evil conscience makes men fear even security. Nameless there is this, hope in God. An unknown man, a prisoner of Elizabeth, has left the longest inscription cut upon these walls. William Rame is a name only. Whatever the cause of his confinement here, and his fate, he carved well and neatly. Be patient in trouble. It is the same message won from experience that so many others have given. Better it is to be in the house of mourning than in the house of banqueting. The heart of the wise is in the mourning house. It is better to have some chastening than to have overmuch liberty. There is a time for all things, a time to be born and a time to die. And the day of death is better than the day of birth. There is an end of all things, and the end of a thing is better than the beginning. Be wise and patient in trouble, for wisdom defendeth as well as money. Use well the time of prosperity, and remember the time of misfortune. XXII. Die Aprilis Anno 1559. William Rame. These scratchings are of many of the captives the only memorial. The Beauchamp Tower is the most typical prison hold in the fortress, with a message that all may read. The stones speak, but only of sadness and suffering borne with fortitude, and of the cruelty of ages now past. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 8. The King's House. The King's House of today, the lieutenant's lodgings of other days, stands against the wall of the inner ward, forming 2 sides of the angle. Before it extends the one wide open quadrangle of the Tower, the paved space still known as Tower Green. The garden where Sir Walter Raleigh walked was there, and no doubt there was grass, and daisies grew, in a bygone age. Now only the black ravens of the tower hop from stone to stone, or shelter in the shadow of the formal lines of sycamores. Occasionally a yeoman warder walking across to the King's house, dressed in his Tudor costume, completes the picturesqueness of this remote corner within the fortress. The Governor and Major of the Tower resides in the King's house, Major General Henry Pippin, C.B., to whose assistance, always kindly given, I have been much indebted when writing these papers, with his wife, and often some pretty grandchildren who, of course, love the Tower. He is the representative of the Constable. The office is always given to an army officer of distinguished service, and by none has been borne more worthily than by this gallant veteran who marched with Roberts to Kandahar. What an age ago that seems now! The view from the great window of what is now the drawing-room is magnificent, over the tree-tops and the shipping down miles of the river, and I should have been more than human not to have envied the occupant these historic quarters. Guy Fawkes. This room was the council chamber of other days. Ghosts do not trouble there, nor, I was assured, did people bother about them. In fact, the ghosts of the Tower are lamentably disappointing. But one might fancy the shade of Guy Fawkes hovering unseen. In this room, then unceilinged and opened to the roof rafters, he was examined by Cecil in the Council of State, but would give nothing beyond a fictitious account of his own origin and life, that his name was Johnston, and other circumstances equally remote from the facts. Thank goodness, the stricter examination which wrung from him the confession afterwards signed by his shaking hand took place away in the depths of the Tower's keep, where the cries of agony from the rack were stifled. The apartment has mementos of James I and of the occasion, a contemporary portrait in relief of that monarch, and a very large tablet in coloured marbles bearing long inscriptions in Latin with some Hebrew in gold letters. The vanity of that wisest fool in Christendom is almost incredible. For a sample of it, I give an English translation from the tablet. James, the great King of Great Britain, most renowned for piety, justice, prudence, learning, courage, clemency, and the other royal virtues, of the Christian faith, of the public safety, of universal peace, the champion, a cherisher, an author, most keen-sighted, most noble, most auspicious. Anne the Queen, the most serene daughter of Frederick II, the most unconquered king of the Danes. Prince Henry, in the adornments of nature, in the strength of learning, in the gifts of grace, most thoroughly versed. To us both born and given by God. Charles, Duke of York, by divine growth for every virtue. Elizabeth, true sister of both, and most worthy of each parent. Do thou, foreseeing, strengthen these as the delicate apple of the eye, and hide them far away from the assaults of the impious, fearless under the shadow of thy wings. The names of the conspirators to the everlasting infamy of themselves, and the eternal detestation of so great savagery. Then follow the names of the Gunpowder Plot conspirators, a long list, and against those of the clerks are cut the words, "Monks who belayed the saving name of Jesus." The texts recited seem to me simple blasphemy. True, it was not King James himself, but a servile lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Waad, that beast Waad, of Raleigh's imprecation, who placed the tablet here, but he knew well his royal master. It was Henry VIII who built the King's house as lodgings for the Lieutenant of the Tower. It coincides in date with the growth in importance of the Lieutenant, who as executive officer, early after, displaced the Constable, his titular head. Centuries later, some stucco-minded person covered the front with stucco, concealing its features. Happily, this has been torn away within the past few years below the gables on the western face, revealing the oak framing and beams and Tudor brick, and the gain thereby in picturesqueness is immense. The plan of the King's house is curious. It is very shallow, and on the first story of the western face, all the rooms open one into another, without other means of communication save by the modern external leads, though on the story above there is a flanking passage, perhaps a later innovation. Where arrow slits occur in the ballium wall against which the King's house is built, in several instances cells have been made in the thickness of the stone wall, and are entered from the rooms. I had thought that each might be an oratory, but the likelier conclusion is that they are prison cells, here under the Lieutenant's immediate supervision. The bell tower, as already explained, forms a corner turret of the King's house, and that is a prison stronghold. Lord Nithsdale's escape. A room interesting for its historical association is a small chamber adjoining the Council room, the door once communicating now being blocked. It is that in which Lady Nithsdale compassed the escape of her husband from the Tower, Lord Nithsdale having been condemned for his part taken in the Scottish Rising of 1715. The next morning he was to have been executed with the Earl of Derwentwater and Viscount Kenmure. Greatly surprised were the crowd on Tower Hill when 2 only, and not 3, of the Jacobite lords came on to the scaffold. This story of a woman's wit and daring has often been told. 3 persons passed in, and 4 passed out, Lord Nithsdale himself in the clothes of his wife's serving woman. The guards were too befogged by so many comings and goings to keep the count. Nithsdale and his heroic wife lived for 32 years thereafter in safety in Rome. Indeed, there is no chamber in the King's house that is not crowded with story, for in the Tower's great days, as a state prison, captives of distinction, prelates, statesmen, warriors, and soldiers of misfortune, dined at the Lieutenant's board, paying handsomely for the privilege, and many were his immediate guests, kept in these separate rooms under key. Anne Boleyn's room. On the topmost story is a little room of sad memories. It is the one in which Queen Anne Boleyn is said to have spent her last days on earth. Whether that be so or not, I cannot tell. Like the scene of her trial within the Tower, the place of her imprisonment has been a subject of much speculation. But that is the tradition this room has, and I know of nothing conclusive to disturb it. It is a little square chamber, measuring 14 feet each way, with panelling in dark oak from floor to the white ceiling. The ceiling is low, so low that one can almost touch it with the upstretched hand. The little room is plain to austereness. It is beneath the second gable from the corner on the western face, as one surveys the King's house from Tower Green. On the upper stone of the mantelpiece, someone has carved a long inscription, now indecipherable, but there is what may be the word Anna. The single casement window opens upon the battlemented walk, Princess Elizabeth's Walk, where the wall falls sheer. That is newly framed. But that apart, the room, except for furniture, survives just as it might have been when Anne Boleyn stepped out to take her place in the guarded procession to the scaffold, raised 4 or 5 steps high, no great length of paces distant. The unhappy Queen had wholly habited herself in a robe of black damask, made in such shape that the cape, which was white, did fall on the outer side thereof. I am tempted to quote once more a familiar passage by Froude. A little before noon, on the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was led down to the green, where the young grass and the first daisies of summer were freshly bursting in the sunshine. A single cannon stood loaded on the battlements. The motionless cannoneer was ready, with smoking linstock at his side, and when the crawling hand upon the dial of the great Tower clock touched the midday hour, that cannon would tell to London that all was over. The yeomen of the guard were there, and a crowd of citizens, the Lord Mayor too, and the deputies of the guilds, and the sheriffs, and the aldermen. They were come to see a spectacle which England had never seen before, a head which had worn the crown, falling under the sword of the executioner. Lady Jane Grey. Next to the King's house on the western side are those of the yeoman jailer and the warders, continuing the row. Gabled and picturesque, apparently of the same age, they will be made the more attractive if at some early day the stucco covering found here, too, is peeled off. The house of the yeoman jailer has one tender memory. It was the place of confinement of Lady Jane Grey. That we know by a letter from the Privy Council. Nathaniel Partridge then held the office. It was gentleman jailer in his time. That officer's duty was to see that all prisoners within the Tower were locked in the quarters of the various warders upon whom they were billeted at the appointed hour at evening. Also he bore the processional axe before a prisoner on his passage by water to Westminster Hall, and on the return journey turned its sharp edge towards his charge had a conviction resulted, that Londoners gathered along the riverside might read by this sign the condemned man's fate. The axe still is preserved in the Major of the Tower's study. The anonymous author of the Chronicle of Queen Jane and Queen Mary has left a pleasant account of the simple life of the 9 Days Queen. On August 29th, 1553, he dined at Partridge's house with my Lady Jane being there present, she sitting at the board's end, Partridge, his wife, Jacob, my lady's gentlewoman, and her man. She commanding Partridge and me to put on our capes, after she had once or twice drunk to me, and bade me heartily welcome, saith she, and forthwith they fell to discourse on matters of religion. With this, and much like talk, the dinner passed away, which ended, I thanked her ladyship that she would vouchsafe, accept me in her company, and she thanked me likewise, and said I was welcome. She thanked Partridge also for bringing me to dinner. Madam, said he, we were somewhat bold, not knowing that your ladyship dined below until we found your ladyship there. And so Partridge and I departed. It is very homely. In the undying pathos of the story of Queen Jane's brief life and death, this dinner with the bluff jailer and his company surely takes an abiding place. The room is still pointed out. The window overlooks the flagged court, and from it Lady Jane Grey peered out unwittingly to see the most agonizing of all sights to one in her situation, the headless body of her young husband, Guilford Dudley, borne past to burial in St. Peter's Church. It was, indeed, as an old chronicler had said, a sight to her no less than death. A few hours later she was herself to die. The scaffold for her, a little way apart, was already prepared. The execution ground. Originally the plot had been a portion of the burial ground of St. Peter Ad Vincula, till in Tudor days it was given over for the execution of prisoners of state. But a few died there. The larger sacrifice was outside the fortress, on Tower Hill, in that oval spot which now is a garden, wherein the children play. You hear their laughter in summer days over the ground saturated with the blood of so many of the noblest and best of our race, and some who were contemptible. The public display of an execution before the thousands who gathered upon Tower Hill was not fitting when women were the victims, and even King Henry VIII, no dispenser of mercy, whatever the sex of those who fell under his fury, sought for the purpose a privacy more becoming, here shut in by the Tower's high walls. Queen Victoria caused the plot to be railed, the stones laid, and the tablet fixed which recalls the grim associations of this place of death. Till then it was unmarked. Near by the church, in the shade of the trees, whose leaves fleck the pavement with shadow and sunlight, it is today the most restful place in the Tower. Seats are there, whereon many a tired visitor, the circuit of inspection completed, will rest and muse over the eventful history of the fortress. You may read the names upon the tablet. Queen Anne Boleyn it was whose head first fell here, by the Calais headsman's sword. Then others by the axe, Queen Catherine Howard, and Viscountess Rochford, and the aged Marchioness of Salisbury, Margaret Pole. Mary's reign sent Lady Jane Grey, and that of Elizabeth her quondam favourite, the Earl of Essex, beheaded here because the Queen's councillors feared a public tumult should he suffer in public. Derrick, the executioner, on passing out of the Tower was violently assailed by the mob, and would have lost his life had not the sheriffs with an armed posse intervened. That is the whole company, 5 women and 1 man. What are 6 heads in the bloody records of the Tower? End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 9 St. John's Chapel. Our Normand invaders built for strength, and the display of naked strength is the dominant characteristic of their architecture. All those who came after toiled to reduce this forbidding aspect of piled stone, giving delicacy to great piers by clustered columns, replacing the semicircular arch by the finer lines of the pointed arch. St. John's Chapel, within the Conqueror's Keep, is severe in aspect, severe and always strong. The columns, so stout that they seem as if stunted in growth, the heavy arches that spring from them might have been built to support, not the narrow triforium and this roof of small span, but the keep itself. St. John's Chapel is the prototype in London. Softer influences begin to awaken in the magnificent Norman fragment of St. Bartholomew the Great, Smithfield, a little later in date, and are highly developed in the round of the Temple Church, erected a century after, to take the early churches easily accessible for comparison. It would almost seem that the builders of St. John's Chapel were contemptuous of ornament. There is a little decoration, very simple, about the capitals of the columns, moulded bands at the bases. That is all. Yet the whole result is most impressive. As you climb the narrow, dark, winding stone staircase, made in the thickness of the exterior wall, to emerge into St. John's Chapel, its austerity seems entirely fitting, and more than anything else within the tower, it brings back the atmosphere and the ideals of the 11th century. There is but one other in all England, the Lady Chapel at Durham Cathedral, to compare with it in its severe restraint and beauty. St. John's Chapel did not always present the plain stone surfaces in walls and floor, piers and arches, as we see them, though so, with little doubt, the Conqueror himself left it. That great church builder, King Henry III, commanded for its adornment that 3 painted glass windows should be made. One should show a little Mary holding the child, and the others represent the Holy Trinity and St. John, Apostle and Evangelist. The rood screen and cross were also ordered by this king, and 2 fair magnes set up, of St. Edward holding a ring, and of St. John the Evangelist, to whom this church is dedicated. Rich tiles will at the same time have covered the stone floor, and it is probable that then, or later, frescoes and hanging tapestries ornamented the plain walls. A throne, or royal pew, was at the western end, by which the visitor of today passes. The Reformation saw the end of all this. The same hideous destruction done here as disfigured so many churches throughout the country. Window glass, smacking of papistry, was smashed, whitewash covered over the mural paintings, and the chapel was despoiled of all of its artistic treasures and ecclesiastical vestments. By Commonwealth times, perhaps before, all use of the chapel for worship had ceased, and as early as Charles II it had become a repository for the state records. Saved from ignominy. For a couple of centuries thereafter, this was its service, a storehouse for the parchments and papers of early parliamentary proceedings, royal writs and litigation, piled up here in the Norman chapel. Not until the year 1857 was the floor cleared, and the documents transferred, with others, to the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane. Then the proposal was actually made by those in authority to convert this venerable and sacred building into a military tailor's warehouse. That was to be the measure of respect paid. Fortunately, the Prince Consort protested, and Queen Victoria, to whose enlightened care for the Tower of London, the most perfect of our historical fortresses, the public today is largely in debt, ordered that the chapel should be reverently treated and returned to religious use. It is crowded with memories, as, indeed, is every chamber and turret and prison room within the Tower. All our Norman and Plantagenet kings worshipped within these stone walls, when Mass was said before the altar, illuminated then, as today, by the sunbeams that fall aslanted through the east window. Before that altar lay in state the mortal remains of Elizabeth of York, King Henry VII's consort, who died in the Tower in childbirth, the pale corpse lighted by the blaze of 800 tapers set in candlesticks about the bier. To that same altar came a prisoner, Lady Jane Grey's dour father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to renounce the Reformed faith, to hear Mass and receive the sacrament. His brief words on that occasion are preserved, but with them one reads his abject appeal to Mary through Arundel that he might live. Yea, the life of a dog, if I might but live and kiss her feet. And the question enters how far that revocation was sincere. Whatever his purpose, he went his way to the block. Long before, the chapel had witnessed a tumultuous scene. Wat Tyler's Kentish rebels overran London. Bursting into the Tower, they found Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, kneeling before this altar, and roughly seizing him, dragged him out to Tower Hill, where his head was struck off amid the delirious shouting of the mob. In the quiet of this same chapel, if tradition be true, Sir Robert Brackenbury, Constable of the Tower, was disturbed at his devotions by the messengers who had ridden hot haste from Richard, Duke of Gloucester, bearing the command to him to murder the little princes left in his charge. To the credit of that stout soldier, who afterwards fell at Bosworth Field, he scornfully refused to perpetrate the foul deed. Knights of the Bath. St. John's Chapel has long associations with the Knights of the Bath. There, certainly since King Henry IV's coronation, the knight aspirant held his vigil all night, kneeling before the altar, watching his arms, ever in his prayers praying and beseeching Almighty God that this passing temporary dignity might be worthily worn by him. The fortunate knight was he who was admitted in summer, when dawn came early. A situation of some delicacy arose when the first Queen, Mary Tudor, ascended the throne. She could not officiate at the bathing solemnities of a large number of young knights, so a deputy of high rank was appointed to conduct the ceremonies in place of the sovereign. Elizabeth adopted the same course. The chapel is larger than it seems. Its massive construction and barrel-shaped stone ceiling tending to belittle its size. Its length is 55 feet 6 inches, and the width is 35 feet. The circular pillars, built up of separate stones to a diameter of 2½ feet, stand but 6 feet 6 inches high above their bases, and each is surmounted by a capital cut out of a solid block of stone. The ceiling is raised above the next floor to the top of the keep, and there is on that floor a passage from the state apartments to the triforium, that upper stage of the chapel having probably been used by members of the royal family when resident in the fortress. There is some interesting old glass in the windows, though it but poorly represents what these lights once contained. Some years back, valuable fragments were found in the crypt, mostly 16th century heraldic glass, and these have been pieced together where possible and utilized for small plaques. St. Peter Ad Vincula has been dealt with separately. Beyond this, and the Royal Chapel of St. John, the Tower had two smaller chapels or oratories, one being in St. Thomas's Tower, which guards the Traitors Gate. The other is in the venerable Wakefield Tower, now used as the Jewel House, on the opposite side of the bailey, but is hardly recognizable as such. It is a mere recess. There, it is said, King Henry VI was at prayer when he was murdered, on the very night of Edward IV's arrival in London in triumph, after Barnet and Tewkesbury had been fought. Between 11 and 12 of the clock, the Duke of Gloucester being then at the Tower, and many others. The towers stand together that have witnessed the murders of 2 English sovereigns, for Edward V, though he was no part in history, was that, the Wakefield and the Bloody Towers. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Tower of London by Walter George Bell. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Janet. Chapter 10 Entrance Towers. Long since the Lion Tower disappeared. Thereby the imposing group of 3 masonry towers, the guardians of the gate, by which the visitor in ancient times had to pass before he entered the outer ward of the Tower of London, was reduced to 2. But in these diminished numbers the group is imposing still. Each of the survivors is pierced with an arch and passageway, low and narrow, having strong circular turrets on either side. In the tower's crowded area there are few views which are so entirely satisfactory as that here illustrated, in range, in variety, and in displaying the formidable nature of this riverside fortress, which stood to guard the capital city. The Middle Tower retains its old name, though now it is meaningless. It looks somewhat surprisingly new, but that is because the external walls of the circular turrets have been recased with Portland stone, and the upper part much modernized. In all probability the structure is as old as King Richard II, and perhaps was built much earlier, as a part of those large external fortifications for which King Henry III was responsible. Central over its arch note the finely carved royal arms. This, however, is Hanoverian, though the amount of city grime that has collected about it, unswept by the wind in its sheltered position, gives the appearance of much greater age. This tower, which today is the first protection of the landward approach to the fortress, had its passageway obstructed by a portcullis. Vaulted chambers of the twin turrets, loopholed and very strong, by their bare stone and entire absence of ornament, convey the suggestion that this is essentially a place for defence. That on the right as you enter does service for the military garrison today as quarters for the spur guard. Originally a drawbridge stood before the Middle Tower, which could be raised or lowered by the troops within. All trace of it has gone. From this outwork runs a permanent bridge and causeway, which spans the moat. It was in front of the Middle Tower that Elizabeth, raised to the throne and returning as Queen to the place where 5 years before she had been a prisoner, alighted from her horse, and kneeling on the ground, gave thanks to God for her deliverance, in Bishop Burnet's words, from a danger so imminent, and for an escape as miraculous as that of David. The Middle Tower, no doubt owing to its exposed position, was not customarily used as a prison. Its only occupant of note was the eccentric Lawrence Shirley, Earl Ferrers. He was hanged at Tyburn in 1760 for the murder of his bailiff Johnson, whom he shot with a pistol in a room, having first closed and locked the door. Ferrers went out to execution in a suit of light cloth embroidered with silver, and drove to the gallows with great state in his own landau drawn by 6 horses. It is not true that he was hanged by a silken cord. That was the privilege of his noble blood, and he claimed it, but the concession was refused, and the enormous crowd assembled at Tyburn saw the Earl dangling from a hempen rope. A century ago John Wilson, one of those implicated in the Cato Street conspiracy, was given temporary lodging in the Middle Tower. That was the last use made of the Tower of London as a state prison, till in our own day the public were reminded with some surprise that the frowning building, founded by William the Conqueror, was London's defence fortress still, and German spies were taken there to be shot at dawn. In its day the second tower has borne different names. It was the Tower of the Gate, and in Henry VIII's time was known as the Warding Gate, but the name of the Byward Tower has been associated with it for some centuries past. It has undergone less change than the Middle Tower, and its dark, weather-worn masonry tells its age, for certainly it is as old as King Richard II. The situation necessitated a strong work, as the gate opens immediately into the Tower of London's outer ward. There is no need in these peaceful times to lower the portcullis, the winch and drums are still above, which hangs ominously overhead as one passes through. But each night the heavy oaken gates are locked with accustomed formality when the chief warder, with the King's keys, makes the round with his guard, and with the closing of the wickets thereafter till sunrise none may enter or leave the fortress. The King's Keys. It is a picturesque ceremony that each night sees repeated within the Tower. As the hour for closing approaches, the chief warder, wearing the scarlet night cloak of his picturesque uniform, with 4 broad stripes on the arm in gold, and carrying in his hand his bunch of keys, proceeds to the main guard, and there asks for the escort for the keys. A sergeant and 4 privates are detailed, one carrying a lantern to light the way about the passages darkened by the high walls. Their steady tramp awakens echoes, for the Tower at night is a silent, eerie place, with mystery in every turret and shadow. As the Barrier Gate, then the Middle Tower, and last the Byward Tower are closed and locked in turn, the escort presents arms at each. The party returns to the main guard, and immediately they pass into the black arch of the Bloody Tower leading to the inner ward. The sentry's challenge rings out, "Halt! Who comes there?" The footfalls are suddenly silenced as the party draws up with a military snap, and the answer is given by the chief warder, "The keys." "Whose keys?" the sentry demands. "King George's keys." "Advance, King George's keys. All's well." And the escort proceeds to the main guard, in front of which they form up, the guard under command of an officer having turned out. The officer gives the order, "Guard and escort present arms," and this honour is paid to the keys. Thereafter the chief warder steps 2 paces in front of the escort, and removing his Tudor hat, calls, "God preserve King George." I see his figure now, scarlet against the indistinct line of khaki in dim moonlight. All present, guard and escort, answer aloud, "Amen." The keys are then carried to the King's house, for delivery to the resident governor, with whom they remain for the night. For how many centuries back this ceremony has been performed, none can tell. The keys of 5 reigning Georges, of James, Charles, Elizabeth, back to the Henrys, back, perhaps, so long as there has been a Tower of London, have in this same manner been saluted. It is a custom that one may hope will never die from disuse, and it has been so often misdescribed by writers upon the Tower that I am glad to give the incidents authoritatively. The head of that fine body of men, the warders of the Tower, old soldiers all and proud of their service, the chief warder, Mr. Smoker, has been my guide on many occasions. He knows the Tower and its history intimately, and fortunate are those confided to such good hands. Once there was change. Queen Victoria died about 7 o'clock on a January night, and in the pressure of so many state matters to be settled immediately, the new sovereign, Albert Edward, had not decided what name he should bear upon the English throne. The Tower was locked as usual, and on the chief warder's return with the escort, answer was given to the sentry's challenge, "The King's keys." Probably never before had the reply not borne a sovereign's name, for even at Lady Jane Grey's brief usurpation the supporters of her cause had first taken care to secure control of the Tower. For 63 years that title, "The King," had not been heard within the walls. Thereafter the answer given nightly was, "King Edward's keys." Each turret of the Byward Tower has a fine vaulted chamber some 15 feet across. That on the right of the entrance is used as the Warder's Lodge, and often a glimpse of the interior is to be obtained through the open door. The windows are loopholed, there is an ancient stone fireplace still in position, and altogether this is one of the best preserved apartments of the fortress. It is believed to have been used as an oratory in the Middle Ages. It has one interesting relic, the shaft of the Staff of Authority, that in ancient times was carried by the Tower's warder when he went aboard ships coming up to the Pool, and levied the toll which was the lieutenant's due upon the produce or wines brought. One half of the shaft is square, and the remainder carved in a spiral. It bore a gold or silver gilt top, which in more careless times than these was lost, or perhaps stolen. Under existing conditions, access cannot be given to the public either to the Middle or Byward Towers. Just past the entrance gate and the vaulted chamber, on the river side, is a low tower which was built to protect the postern opening upon the light bridge that here crosses the moat. The massive door, barred and clamped, and still creaking upon its hinges, made the place secure. A light drawbridge originally spanned the moat. By this way persons of distinction, having landed from their boats at the Queen's Stairs on the wharf, might enter the Tower without passing through that place of forbidding associations, the Traitors Gate. Lions at the Tower. The Lion Tower stood where now is the refreshment room, and the path before it leading on to the Tower Wharf. It was in ancient times water surrounded by a diversion of the moat, and there were caged those royal animals that were made gifts to our kings by foreign potentates. Lions and other beasts were confined there so late as 1834. They were then moved to form the nucleus of the collection at the Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park. And few will probably recall that the common phrase, "seeing the lions of the city," originated from this sight at the Tower of London. King Henry III had leopards in this menagerie at the Tower, and later an elephant and 2 wildcats added to its wonders. The sheriffs of London in the year 1252 were ordered to provide a muzzle and a long cord for the bear, while he was led to the Thames to fish for his diet, and a smaller chain for securing him, but the bruin's appetite being thereby unsatisfied, 4d. a day was devoted to his keep. He was perhaps a polar bear, and so fond of fish, as he is described as "white" and "from Norway," not the most tractable creature to lead out. The master of the King's bears and apes, in former days, was an official post. Old prints of the Tower in the time of King James I show the pit for baiting the bear, and there Londoners gathered to witness that cruel sport. 11 lions were kept at the Tower early in the 18th century. Dr. Johnson commended them as a sight for gaping Scotsmen come to see our southern wonders, but the best account we have of the occupants of the Royal Menagerie is from a German traveller, Paul Hentzner, who came in Queen Elizabeth's reign. He wrote, "On coming out of the Tower, we were led to a small house close by, where are kept a variety of creatures, viz. 3 lionesses, 1 lion of great size, called Edward VI, from his having been born in that reign, a tiger, a lynx, a wolf excessively old. This is a very scarce animal in England, so that their sheep and cattle stray about in great numbers, free from any dangers, though without anybody to keep them. There is besides a porcupine and an eagle. All these creatures are kept in a remote place, fitted up for the purpose with wooden lattices at the Queen's expense. A kindly correspondent has increased my knowledge of natural history at the Tower by sending me the card here reproduced. It admitted the bearer to witness the annual ceremony of washing the lions. Amid the smuts of London, Leo was in sad case with a bath once a year. The joke was played off upon guileless countrymen up to see the wonders of the metropolis, who were given the card as a coveted privilege, or more likely were asked to pay for it by hangers about the gates. Seal and signature support the impostor, but the date of the ceremony, the 1st of April, should have excited suspicion. Now 5 or 6 years ago, the privileges given to the public were considerably enlarged by liberty to visit the dungeons of the Keep, the Bloody Tower, and, subject to a warder being free for the duty, the chapel of St. Peter Ad Vincula. It can be no secret that, even before the war, larger concessions than these were contemplated. A military fortress the Tower was when built, and such it remains in the 20th century. It is not practicable at present to convert it into a great national museum, as it might well become, a museum of which the greatest riches must always be its own matchless buildings and historical associations. If ever that comes about, the warders of the Tower will always, I hope, be retained as guardians of the place, a part of this rich history. But something might be done to enlarge the public's opportunity for inspection could satisfactory quarters be found elsewhere for the staff of warders, who now are housed, not always comfortably, in many of the ancient towers about the walls. There is one obvious place for building, and one alone, within the Tower's circuit, and that is about the entrance. If new building, now or at some future time, is to be undertaken to accommodate the warders and their families, and thus allow the public admission to many places from which they are now shut out, might it not be possible to reconstruct the Lion Tower in some modified form? A replica of the old Lion Tower, which, so far as we know, had no height or architectural features, is not desirable nor possible for the purpose. It seems to have been little more than a casement and barbette. But here is space and opportunity for something that might be worthy. The present entrance, through a decaying fence of wooden stakes, the wooden shed on the left of the path at which bags and parcels are left, and the wooden-built refreshment room just beyond, can well be spared. They form together a disgraceful approach to what should be the most treasured of the nation's possessions. There is nothing else in Great Britain, nothing in the world, with the age and the continuous history of the Tower of London, nothing that can be compared with it save, perhaps, St. Angelo in Rome. It is in the keeping of London, because London has for more than 1,000 years been the actual, if not always the titular, capital of the kingdom. I should like to feel sure that all Londoners know it. The Tower of London, always so strong, has never been called upon to withstand a serious siege. England, since the Conqueror built his frowning keep, has never known a foreign invader. Partisans in times of national tumult have been surrounded in the fortress. Stone cannon balls were recovered from the accumulated mud when the Duke of Wellington, who in his old age was Constable of the Tower, caused the moat to be drained and filled to its present height. They are believed to have been fired by the Yorkists against the walls in the year 1460. In Sir Thomas Wyatt's rising against Queen Mary, the tower was cannonaded very ineffectually from across the river. It has never, in its centuries of history, been exposed to such peril as during the late European war, and then from an element which Gundulf and his successors in military architecture could safely ignore. It was a prominent mark for German aviators, especially in the daylight raids. A bomb, 4½ feet in length, fell in the moat, penetrated deep, but most fortunately did not explode. A second dropped uncomfortably close in the Mint, causing some deaths, and in all 44 casualties. Another hit the railings north of the tower, and a fourth dived harmlessly into the river, throwing up a great splash of water. The yeoman warders to-day, picturesque figures, still wearing the Tudor dress, the oldest uniform of the British Army, with, alas, the terrible anachronism of trousers, have these tales to add to the crowded records of the Tower. So still the long story grows. End of chapter 10. Recording by Janet. End of The Tower of London by Walter George Bell.